Last month we began to look at this song, especially the bits at the end of chapter 52. And we saw that the servant will succeed, that the servant will be exalted, the servant will have a worldwide impact, the servant will be victorious over every enemy. Indeed, God has highly exalted him and given him the name that is above every name, that at the name of Jesus every knee should bow, of those in heaven and of those on earth and of those under the earth, and that every tongue should confess that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father. And all those points go together. They have a similar sort of direction to them, don't they? And they call us then to rejoice, to have confidence, to prepare for expansion, as we saw in Isaiah 54. But in the middle of them, we have that surprise, that shock. We find that the servant will be repulsive. People will be astonished, shocked, appalled at him. He's going to be marred, disfigured. Word that's used in Malachi of a blemished animal that's not fit to use for sacrifice. People are going to assume that this person is unclean. He's suffering so greatly because of his sins. God's punishing him for some great wickedness. And how does that fit with the rest of the picture? How can the path of victory and exaltation lie through such intense suffering? Well, the answer to that is found in chapter 53. And the first thing we see in that chapter is that the servant lives a life of rejection. The servant lives a life of rejection. Isaiah begins the chapter by asking, who's believed our report? Well, not many. The prophet's been given a message from God to pass on to the people, but it's generally ignored. To whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed? In Isaiah 51:9, the arm of the Lord refers to God himself, the way he acted in person at the Exodus. Awake, awake, put on strength, O arm of the Lord. Awake as in the ancient days, in the generations of old. Are you not the arm that cut Rahab apart and wounded the serpent? And then there's Isaiah 52, verse 10, just before this song. The Lord has made bare his holy arm in the eyes of all the nations, and all the ends of the earth shall see the salvation of our God. The arm is bare, the sleeves are rolled up for action. The Lord purposes again to act personally. But most people don't recognize that this servant is the arm of the Lord coming to act in salvation. Only those to whom it is revealed. Unless God manifests his power, men will not be converted. Even the miracles don't convince people. John reports that although Jesus had done so many signs before them, they did not believe in him. That the word of Isaiah the prophet might be fulfilled, which he spoke. Lord, who has believed our report? And to whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed? And similarly, Paul reports they have not all obeyed the gospel. For Isaiah says, Lord, who has believed our report? And they see the servant, they hear about him, but they dismiss it. What do people see when they look at this servant? An impressive Marvel Comics superhero with wonderful powers? A cool celebrity, perfect features, an impressive Instagram profile? No, as far as they're concerned, the servant's a tender plant, a root out of dry ground. And such plants tend to be weak and struggling. They're not impressive to look at. This is here the insignificant appearance of the servant, the unglamorous environment he's come from. He has no form or comeliness, nothing particularly attractive about him, nothing to make him stand out from the crowd. He's not head and shoulders above the rest like Saul. He's not the most handsome man in the land. There's no outward splendour about him. When we see him, there's no beauty that we should desire him. It's as if the prophet says, We look at him, but there's nothing to look at. He's just an uneducated Galilean peasant of dubious parentage. And what's the result? He's despised and rejected by men. Not just ignored, treated as unimportant, insignificant, actively despised, considered to be worthless, unworthy of attention, treated with contempt and scorn, rejected, discarded. He came to his own, and his own did not receive him. And he's not a marble statue impervious to people's scorn. He's a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. He feels the hurt of rejection, the pain of contempt. He personally experiences sorrow. And also he associates with others who are suffering. He's a man of pain and sickness. So we hid, as it were, our faces from him. A man who has terminal cancer is often shunned by his friends. They don't know how to handle it, how to respond to it, and so they stay away. That's the kind of thing that happens here. They can't handle this kind of a servant. He's not the sort of saviour they expect. He's not a powerful, dynamic, attractive figure who mixes with the good and great. He's someone who associates with the lowly, the insignificant, the sinners. He was despised, and we did not esteem him. Esteem's an accounting word, reckoning up of value. They praised what they saw, and it added up to nothing. What kind of a saviour are you looking for? What kind of person will you follow? Are you looking for someone strong and impressive? Or will you follow one who came in weakness? Be aware, if you follow this servant, people will treat you the way they treated him. Jesus warned his disciples, a servant is not greater than his master. If they persecuted me, they will also persecute you. Are you ready to be despised and rejected? Or are you like Mr. Byends in Pilgrim's Progress? He contrasts himself with Christian and hopeful. They believe it to be their duty to rush ahead on their journey in all types of weather, while I am for waiting for the right wind and tide. They are for risking all for God, and in an instant I would grasp advantages that secure my life and property. They are for holding on to their beliefs even though all other men oppose them. But I am for religion that is tolerant of the times and not a threat to my safety. They are for religion when it dresses in rags and is regarded as contemptible. I am for religious company that walks in golden slippers in the sunshine while observers applaud. Which would you be, Mr. Byends or Christian and hopeful? The servant lives a life of rejection. I want to pass over verses 4 to 6 for the moment. See that first the servant voluntarily accepts an undeserved death. He freely accepts a death he doesn't deserve. He's innocent of any wrongdoing, but he allows himself to be taken to execution. Look at verse 7. He was oppressed and he was afflicted, yet he opened not his mouth. He was led as a lamb to the slaughter, and as a sheep before its shearers is silent, so he opened not his mouth. He was oppressed. That's the word that was used of the oppression of the people of Israel in Egypt, in their slavery there. He was afflicted, could be translated. He allowed himself to be afflicted, or he kept submitting to affliction. See, it wasn't forced on him the way it was forced on the Israelites. They had to serve their Egyptian taskmasters. There's no choice about it. But the servant wasn't a helpless victim. He willingly accepted affliction and indeed death. For this reason the Father loves me, because I lay down my life, that I may take it up again. No one takes it from me, but I lay it down of my own accord. Sheep don't know whether they're going to slaughter or shearing. But the servant didn't go ignorantly to his death. He knew beforehand all that was going to happen to him. John 18:4, we read that when Jesus approached Jesus in the garden with his band of soldiers, Jesus, therefore, knowing all things that would come upon him, went forward and said to them, "Who are you seeking?" He allowed himself to be arrested. Didn't have to do that. Matthew's account of the incident, he says to Peter, "Do you think I cannot appeal to my Father? He will at once send me more than 12 legions of angels." How then should the scriptures be fulfilled that it must be so? He offered no resistance. He could have wiped out those soldiers. But he accepted it. And didn't even offer verbal resistance and protest, despite the injustice and the harsh treatment we received. We read in Mark 14 of his trial before the Jewish council that many bore false witness against Jesus. Their testimonies didn't agree. The high priest stood up in the midst and asked Jesus, saying, "Do you answer nothing? What is it these men testify against you?" But he kept silent and answered nothing. It was the same when they brought him to Pilate. While he was being accused by the chief priests and elders, he answered nothing. And Pilate said to him, "Do you not hear how many things they testify against you?" But he answered him not one word, so that the governor marveled greatly. And the same thing happened again when Pilate sent him to Herod. Herod was exceedingly glad when he saw Jesus. He desired for a long time to see him. He'd heard many things about him. He hoped to see some miracle done by him. Then he questioned him with many words. But he answered him nothing. No protest, no answering these false accusations. Perhaps we should notice one other aspect of his silence. No reproach for those who forsook him and fled. After those trials, he was taken out to die, led to execution. Taken, it says in our translation, from prison and from judgment. Every word in that phrase has a variety of possible meanings. Could simply be saying a statement of facts. After arrest and sentence, he was taken out. Or it could point to injustice. Without restraint, without justice, or by perversion of justice. We won't take the time to go into it now, but if you were to read Brian Russell's book on the servant songs, called Behold My Servant, he's got several pages recounting the various ways in which the things that were done at Jesus' trials were illegal. He was taken away unjustly. And the next expression also subject to varying interpretations. Who will declare his generation? Perhaps should be translated, as for his contemporaries, who pondered? In other words, who realized the significance of what was happening? He was cut off from the land of the living. For the transgressions of my people he was stricken. He was done to death, but not because of his own guilt. And then verse 9 speaks of his burial. They made his grave with the wicked, but with the rich at his death. Wicked is plural, rich is singular. Somehow he was associated in his death both with wicked people and a rich man. If you take it on its own, that's a rather puzzling statement. And one commentator even writes that without the commentary supplied by the fulfillment, it would be impossible to understand verse 9 at all. But we know what actually happened. The expectation was that as a condemned criminal, the corpse of Jesus would be thrown into the common pit that was reserved for paupers and criminals. Wouldn't receive a proper burial. But instead, he was buried in a rich man's tomb. Matthew tells us that when evening had come, there came a rich man from Arimathea named Joseph, who himself had also become a disciple of Jesus. This man went to Pilate and asked for the body of Jesus. Then Pilate commanded the body to be given to him. When Joseph had taken the body, he wrapped it in a clean linen cloth and laid it in his new tomb, which he had hewn out of the rock. And again, in the explanation of that, we're told that it was through no fault of his own that he suffered. He had done no violence. Could be translated, he had practiced none violence. It's not just that he didn't commit deeds of violence. He pursued a deliberate policy of avoiding that kind of thing. Nor was any deceit in his mouth. He never deliberately deceived anyone, never misled anyone, never tricked anyone. Totally guiltless in word and deed, outward conduct, inward character. And so we see that the servant is despised and rejected in his life. And then he suffers the death of a criminal, although he's totally innocent. He voluntarily goes to that death. But he isn't a martyr in the sense of being a helpless victim of circumstances or the fierce opposition of his enemies. He freely goes to that ugly, unjust death. Why? Why do that? The end of verse 8 explains, "For the transgressions of my people he was stricken." It wasn't because of his own guilt, because of other people's sin. Could be rendered, "For the rebellion of my people to whom the blow was due." And here we turn back to the centre of the song, to verses 4 to 6. Surely he has borne our griefs and carried our sorrows. Yet we esteemed him stricken, smitten by God and afflicted. But he was wounded for our transgressions. He was bruised for our iniquities. The chastisement for our peace was upon him, and by his stripes we are healed. All we like sheep have gone astray. We've turned every one to his own way, and the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. The servant was despised and rejected, treated as a criminal and executed. People thought he was smitten by God. They thought God was punishing him for his sins. Because he'd suffered so much, he must have been particularly wicked. But they had it all wrong. Yes, he was suffering because of sin. But it wasn't his own sin. He was perfectly innocent. He was suffering in the place of sinners, taking the punishment they deserved. Most of us can think of stories we've read of people being convicted of crimes they didn't commit. They've gone to prison, maybe even been executed because of mistaken identity or corruption or prejudice. They were innocent. They've been punished as though they were guilty, while the real criminals go free. And sometimes years or even decades later, fresh evidence comes to light. The guilty verdict's overturned. But that's not what we have here. It's not a simple miscarriage of justice. And not is it merely a case of suffering alongside others. You know how Hamas deliberately uses civilians as human shields. So innocent people are often killed in attacks directed against terrorists. It isn't a case of the innocent suffering along with the guilty. It's the innocent one taking the place of the guilty. That's a deliberate exchange. Think of football. When one player replaces another on the pitch, it's not an accident. It's an intentional substitution. And so it is here. Look at the way Isaiah writes it. Surely he has borne our griefs and carried our sorrows. He was wounded for our transgressions. He was bruised for our iniquities. The chastisement of our peace was upon him. By his stripes we are healed. The Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. He has borne our griefs and carried our sorrows, taken on an obligation that belonged to us. He's not just shared our load. He's taken that burden away and disposed of it. Imagine you're out on the hills with a heavy rucksack. It's becoming too much to carry. Someone comes along and takes that rucksack off your back. And he doesn't just hold one strap while you hold the other, so that you're carrying it between the two of you. He puts the rucksack on his own on his own back. He bears the full weight of it himself. You're completely relieved of the load. That's the picture we have here. When it was happening, we didn't realize what was going on. We thought he'd been rejected by God. We received him stricken, smitten by God, and afflicted. 3 terms used there to show how greatly he suffered. And like Job's comforters, we reckoned it was God who'd caused him to suffer that way. We thought that suffering was divine retribution for sin. Great suffering meant a great sinner. But now we realize it was our burden he was bearing. Our guilt he was carrying, not our own, not his own. The very things that made us disregard him are the things that should cause us to honour him. It was for our sake he endured them. He was wounded for our transgressions, bruised for our iniquities. That word wounded or pierced would be a better translation, usually refers to a deadly wound. It's one that's deliberately inflicted, not the result of a disease or an accident. It's only used in Isaiah 51, in chapter 51:9. I quoted it earlier. Are you not the arm that cut Rahab apart and wounded the spirit? Part of the appeal for God to act as he did in the past. Mattia comments, when they called on the arm of the Lord who dealt the monster Rahab a death blow, they didn't know they were calling the arm to his own death. Bruised, we better rendered crushed. It's a strong metaphor, being ground to dust. Could be used of people being trampled to death. E.J. Young says that the 2 words that are chosen there, pierced through and crushed, are among the strongest expressions in the Hebrew language to denote a violent and painful death. Why was such a painful death necessary? Because of our transgressions, our iniquities. First word refers to our rebellious acts. One case of just human weakness, deliberate revolt, intentional rebellion against God's commands. The second word speaks of the bentness of fallen human nature, conduct twisted out of its proper shape. You have a description at the very beginning of Isaiah of God lamenting the state of his people. Alas, sinful nation, a people laden with iniquity, a brood of evildoers, children who are corrupters. They've forsaken the Lord. They've provoked to anger the Holy One of Israel. They've turned away backward. The whole head is sick, and the whole heart faints. From the sole of the foot even to the head, there's no soundness in it, but wounds and bruises and putrefying sores. They've not been closed or bound up or soothed with ointment. It's not how the people of Israel thought of themselves. They wouldn't recognize that picture. And often we don't either, do we? We tend to make light of our sin, excuse our shortcomings, explain away our mistakes. But God will have none of it. It's rebellion. It's crookedness. Dealing with it requires drastic action, piercing through and crushing. It's not enough to promise to be good in the future, even if we could manage it. Writing new words over the old ones won't blot out the old ones. Someone has to come and wipe the slate clean. Someone has to come and take the disease, to give back health, to bear the blows, give back well-being. The chastisement for our peace was upon him, the correction that brought us peace. I know that word peace in the Hebrew, shalom. It's a very rich word. It speaks of total well-being before God. Wholeness, preservation, salvation. Not just earthly peace, peace with God. Full reconciliation, removal of all barriers to fellowship. By his stripes, his wounds, we are healed, restored to complete wholeness. All we like sheep have gone astray. We've turned every one to his own way, and the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of our soul. Here's the greatest of mysteries. The Lord has laid on him the iniquity of our soul. All that has happened, as Peter says, happened by the determined purpose and foreknowledge of God. He planned it all. He carried it out. He used human instruments. Those instruments are responsible for their actions. But behind it all is the Lord himself. And that leads us to the final stanza of the song. It pleased the Lord to bruise him. He has put him to grief. It pleased the Lord to crush him. Isn't that a worse answer than saying it was all a tragic accident? Or part of the absurdity and meaninglessness of life? Why would God want to crush an innocent man? Does it mean God's a sadist who delights in causing suffering? No. It means that God had a greater purpose in what was happening than that of avoiding pain. He was pleased to crush his servant because there's no other way to accomplish his purpose. That's why he put him to grief, caused him to suffer. The word's related to the one in verse 3, and as in that verse, used in a wider sense, both physical and spiritual suffering. God didn't delight in the sufferings in themselves, but in what he accomplished through them. What was that purpose? What could possibly be great enough to justify the tremendous suffering the servant endured? It was to make his soul an offering for sin, a guilt offering. You can read about that in Leviticus 5 and 6. Guilt offering atoned for specific known sins. Retained the ideas of propitiation and expiation that you had in burnt and sin offerings. Added the need to make restitution or compensation to those who'd been wronged in order to restore a right relationship. And so the death of the servant satisfied both the needs of sinful people before God and the requirements of God related to his broken law, his offended holiness. And Matthias says there are three possible ways to translate the clause about the guilt offering. We have it in the New King James Version, when you make his soul an offering for sin, where you is the Lord. Taking it that way means that the Lord is the effective agent behind the servant's work. And so it's effective both in the objective fruits of it, the offspring of verse 10, and the subjective rewards prolonging his days. But it could also be rendered when his soul makes a guilt offering. And there it's saying the precious reality at the heart of the saving work is the person, the soul of the servant. Because he's so uniquely fitted to be the substitute. His saving work is successful. And then the third possibility is again reading it as in the New King James, but taking the word you to refer to the individual, the person who draws near to the servant, who nominates him as the needed offering for guilt. You know how the Israelite would lay his hand on the sacrifice, symbolically transferring his guilt. In this case, he's making his personal, individual response to what the servant has done. He's not seeing it just as an abstract theory. He sees his own personal need. He comes in faith to the servant as the guilt offering that he needs. Have you done that? 3 ways you can understand the expression. And Matthew comments that each of them is legitimate as a translation and significant as a truth. It's as if we can see more than one meaning in what he wrote. We may be sure that Isaiah did too, and that he deliberately left it like that. What does this guilt offering accomplish? First, he shall see his seed. His work will provide him with spiritual children. We strayed as sheep. We return as sons. Secondly, he shall prolong his days. Well, that seems odd, doesn't it? He'll prolong his days by being killed. How's that possible? Only through resurrection. Christ, having been raised from the dead, dies no more. Death no longer has dominion over him. Thirdly, the pleasure of the Lord shall prosper in his hand. One writer comments, this is the mystery of the cross. It was on that instrument of human torture Jesus Christ made his soul an offering to God for other people's sins. So the cross was no defeat. As I can see, Jesus was taking the initiative by his death, making the will of God prosper in the most improbable way imaginable. At his cross, Jesus achieved the ancient purpose of God with victorious love. The pleasure of the Lord shall prosper in his hand. Perhaps it points rather to the fact that through his resurrection and ascension, Christ resumed his activity, directing God's purposes to full completion. And fourth, he shall see the labour of his soul and be satisfied. He'll be satisfied with what he sees, with the result of his work. Christian, do you realise that Christ sees you with satisfaction, with pleasure? Fifthly, by his knowledge my righteous servant shall justify many, for he shall bear their iniquities. And here again there are 2 ways at least that it could be understood. We can think of it as the servant's knowledge. If he'd not known exactly what was needed, known how to do it, nothing could have been achieved. If he'd not been utterly righteous before the Lord, my righteous servant, he couldn't have been the substitute for others, because the lamb had to be perfect. That's one way of taking the reference to knowledge, the servant's knowledge. But it could also mean the knowledge that people have of the servant. They are justified by knowing him. It includes knowing the facts about him, who he is, what he's done. It goes beyond that to faith, trust, belief. It's through knowing him in that sense people are justified. What about you? Have you put your trust in him? Do you know him in that full sense? And then he says the servant will be victorious over every foe. Therefore I will divide him a portion with the great, he shall divide the spoil with the strong. Commented last time that wasn't a very good translation. That word great has come repeatedly through the song, and everywhere else it's translated many, and so it should be here. As his inheritance, the servant is given the many. Those his iniquity he's taken away, those who put their trust in him. And the translation also suggests He'll just be given a share of the plunder, like one of a number of heroes. But again, that's not what's in view. John Mackay brings out the meaning with his translation. I will allot to him the many. He will divide the strong as booty. As Mackay says, the resurrected servant is here alone on the victor's podium, not lined up among a crowd in the hall of fame. What's the explanation of this victory? Not what you might expect, given how victories are usually won, but what this song's been telling us all along. Because he poured out his soul unto death, he was numbered with the transgressors. It was through death that he achieved life. Through humiliation that he came to triumph and exaltation. He bore the sin of many, made intercession for the transgressors. That word many again. Bore the sin of many. Picked up in the New Testament, Jesus said, even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, to give his life a ransom for many. Or Paul, the free gift is not like the trespass. For if many died through one man's trespass, much more of the grace of God and the free gift by the grace of that one man, Jesus Christ, abounded for many. Christ's work of atonement is complete. He's bore the sin of many. He paid the full penalty for all the sins of all his people. But he isn't now idle. He is able to save to the uttermost those who come to God through him, since he always lives to make intercession for them. He's placed himself between the rebels and the punishment they deserved. Take it on himself. And he continues to place himself between his people and their sin. Doesn't plead for mercy on the grounds of any goodness in them. He pleads the efficacy of that once-for-all offering he's made of himself. And so Paul exclaims, who shall bring a charge against God's elect? It is God who justified. Who is he who condemns? It is Christ who died, and furthermore is also risen, who is even at the right hand of God, who also makes intercession for us. And so we answer the question, how can the path of victory and exaltation lie through such intense suffering? Because through that life of rejection, through that voluntary death, through that substitutionary atonement, that Christ overcame the greatest of enemies, sin and Satan. Satan's now a defeated foe. Christ has conquered. Remember that key word, many, we've seen throughout the song, maybe few in number here today. We're only a very small part of a very big picture. John writes, after these things I looked, and behold a great multitude, which no one could number, of all nations, tribes, peoples and tongues, standing before the throne and before the Lamb, clothed with white robes, with palm branches in their hands, and crying out with a loud voice, saying, salvation belongs to our God, who sits on the throne, and to the Lamb. Satan, the defeated foe, Christ is liberating his captives. And sin need not have the last word in our lives. Christ has paid the full penalty for every sin of every one of his people. We don't need to bear it ourselves. We can have a right standing before God. Paul writes, we are ambassadors for Christ. As though God were pleading through us, we implore you on Christ's behalf, be reconciled to God. For he made him who knew no sin to be sin for us, that we might become the righteousness of God in him. Again I say, there is the great exchange. Christ has paid the penalty, that sinners may go free, that they may have Christ's righteousness attributed to them. And that invitation then to come to him is open to all. We ambassadors for Christ, as though God were pleading through us. We implore you on Christ's behalf, be reconciled to God. Don't continue to bear that weight. Put your hands, as it were, on the hand of the sacrifice. Recognize him taking your place, that you may go free.